In a landmark decision that will be studied for years to come, the Supreme Court has struck down the Trump administration's sweeping tariffs, sending shockwaves through the world of international commerce and American politics alike. This ruling fundamentally alters the landscape of U.S. trade policy and redefines the boundaries of executive authority, signaling a new era in how America approaches its economic relationships with the world. The case centered on the president's use of emergency powers to unilaterally reshape trade agreements, raising critical questions about whether such sweeping actions could bypass the checks and balances enshrined in the Constitution. By ruling against the administration, the court has reasserted Congress's constitutional role in trade matters, setting a powerful precedent that will limit future presidents from enacting major economic measures without legislative approval. For years, businesses, investors, and global markets have faced uncertainty and volatility under these tariffs. Today's decision brings a sudden and dramatic clarity, prompting immediate reactions from Wall Street to Main Street. The justices made it unmistakably clear: only Congress, as the direct representative of the people, has the authority to overhaul America's trade relationships, not the president acting alone. This marks a pivotal turning point in the ongoing story of the separation of powers, reinforcing the system of checks and balances that is at the heart of American democracy, especially in the realm of economic policy. The administration now faces the challenge of responding to this significant setback, while America's trading partners and allies around the globe are watching closely to see how the U.S. will move forward in its trade negotiations. The long-term impact on U.S. global economic leadership, competitiveness, and diplomatic influence remains uncertain as markets and policymakers alike adjust to this new legal reality. The story of law, power, and constitutional principles continues to unfold, reminding us that the balance between branches of government is never static, but always evolving with the times. The legal battle began when the Trump administration announced a sweeping set of tariffs targeting billions of dollars worth of imported goods. These measures were presented as a bold move to protect American industries from what the administration described as unfair foreign competition and threats to national security. Officials argued that these tariffs would revitalize domestic manufacturing, safeguard American jobs, and strengthen the nation's economic independence. The administration insisted that such steps were necessary to ensure the country's long-term security and prosperity. However, business groups, importers, and trade associations quickly pushed back. They challenged the administration's authority, arguing that the president had overstepped constitutional boundaries by imposing what amounted to a massive tax on American consumers and companies without direct approval from Congress. The resulting lawsuit raised a fundamental question: could the executive branch use emergency statutes to bypass Congress and unilaterally reshape trade policy? The tariffs sent shockwaves through the economy, creating widespread uncertainty. Many businesses were forced to absorb higher costs, pass them on to consumers through price hikes, or completely overhaul their supply chains to adapt to the new trade landscape. As the case moved through the courts, it became clear that this was more than a dispute over trade policy. It was a pivotal test of the separation of powers, raising questions about the limits of presidential authority and the role of Congress in shaping economic policy. At its core, the case asked, how far can a president stretch the definition of national emergency to justify sweeping executive actions that impact millions? The Supreme Court's eventual decision would not only resolve the immediate dispute, but also set a precedent, shaping the constitutional balance of power between the branches of government for years to come. The administration relied on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, a law meant for targeted sanctions against foreign threats. Instead, the White House used IEEPA to justify broad tariffs, arguing unfair trade practices threatened U.S. economic security. Critics said this was never Congress's intent. IEEPA was a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. The Supreme Court agreed, ruling the president's use of IEEPA for sweeping tariffs exceeded its purpose and infringed on Congress's trade authority. The decision restores IEEPA to its original limited scope. The legal fight began in the U.S. Court of International Trade, where the administration initially prevailed. Business groups appealed, sharpening their arguments around separation of powers and IEEPA's history. The Federal Circuit reversed the lower court, finding presidential overreach and setting up a Supreme Court showdown. Both sides petitioned the High Court, given the profound constitutional stakes. The Supreme Court's decision to hear the case signaled its national importance. During oral arguments, justices probed the limits of executive power and congressional intent. The final ruling struck down the tariffs, establishing a precedent that will shape presidential authority for generations. The legal saga ends, but its impact will echo through American governance. The Supreme Court's ruling recalibrates presidential power, especially in economic policy. By invalidating the tariffs, the court reasserts Congress's constitutional authority over trade. The message is clear: presidents cannot use broad emergency declarations to enact sweeping economic changes without Congress. Future administrations must now seek legislative approval for major trade actions. The decision narrows executive options, requiring more precise legal justifications for trade interventions. Emergency powers are no longer a catch-all for economic policy. While the president retains other trade authorities, this ruling is a powerful check on executive overreach. It's a reaffirmation of American checks and balances. The administration defended its tariffs as vital to national security, arguing that a weakened industrial base threatened U.S. defense. They claimed IEEPA's broad language allowed swift action against economic threats. The White House insisted the president needed flexibility to respond to evolving dangers, portraying tariffs as necessary, not a circumvention of Congress. They urged courts to defer to presidential judgment in national security. But the Supreme Court prioritized constitutional limits over executive discretion. The defense failed at the highest level, reinforcing the separation of powers. The tariffs and ongoing legal uncertainty have cost U.S. businesses and consumers over $100 billion, with the brunt of the impact felt most acutely in the manufacturing and technology sectors. Companies faced higher costs for imported components, which were often passed on to consumers in the form of increased prices for everyday goods, electronics, and appliances. Small businesses in particular struggled to absorb these sudden expenses, leading to tighter margins and difficult decisions about hiring and investment. Retaliatory measures from China and the European Union quickly escalated the situation, triggering a full-blown trade war. This tit-for-tat exchange disrupted global supply chains, causing delays in shipments, shortages of key products, and uncertainty for companies that rely on international trade. As a result, world GDP growth slowed, with ripple effects felt in both developed and emerging economies. Investment and international cooperation suffered as companies hesitated to commit resources in such a volatile environment. Many firms postponed expansion plans, delayed new projects, or even scaled back operations, fearing further policy changes or additional tariffs. Financial markets responded with heightened volatility, fluctuating wildly with each new development or rumor. Today's Supreme Court ruling, however, sparked a wave of optimism, leading to a notable market rally as investors anticipated a return to more stable trade conditions. The US dollar dipped in value as the prospect of trade normalization loomed, reflecting shifting investor sentiment and expectations of increased global commerce. For American workers, the impact was mixed. While some industries, such as domestic steel and aluminum, saw short-term gains and job growth, many more jobs were lost in sectors heavily reliant on imports or exports. Layoffs, reduced hours, and business closures became common in affected regions, leaving communities uncertain about their economic future. Agriculture was hit especially hard by retaliatory tariffs, with farmers facing plummeting exports, unsold crops piling up in storage, and mounting financial stress. Many turned to government aid, but uncertainty persisted. Overall, most economic analyses found that the tariffs slightly dragged on U.S. employment and growth, contributing to a slower pace of job creation and a more cautious business climate. This episode highlights the complex, often unintended consequences of broad protectionist policies. What began as an effort to protect domestic industries quickly evolved into a tangled web of global repercussions, regulatory confusion, and economic uncertainty. The Supreme Court's decision finally brings long-awaited clarity, offering hope for a more predictable trade environment and a path forward for businesses, workers, and policymakers alike. The Supreme Court's decision limits IEEPA's use, But the president still has other trade tools. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act allows tariffs if imports threaten national security, as seen with steel and aluminum. Section 301 of the Trade Act lets the U.S. respond to unfair foreign practices, providing a targeted, process-driven approach. These statutes require specific findings and procedures, unlike the broad emergency powers just struck down. The administration will now rely more on these established laws for future trade actions. The era of sweeping, emergency-based tariffs is over, but targeted disputes remain possible. U.S. trade policy remains complex and dynamic. The Supreme Court's decision is a constitutional milestone, reaffirming Congress's authority over trade. The case forced a re-examination of decades of delegated presidential power. The court's message emergency powers are not a blank check, and Congress must reclaim its legislative role. Lawmakers are challenged to be more deliberate when granting authority to the executive. The ruling ends a period of economic uncertainty and sets a major precedent limiting presidential power. While the president retains other trade tools, the legal landscape is fundamentally changed. The decision reasserts the separation of powers at the heart of American democracy. The question now, how will the U.S. lead in a rapidly evolving global economy?